Hello, my name is Victor Corso. I'm a professor of international law in Mexico, and today I will wade into the discussion related to Mexico's lack of congratulations before Joe Biden's victory in the US presidential election. First of all, let's recognize the elephant in the room. The race between Donald Trump and Joe Biden was unusual by all means. 2020 has been an uncommon year with the pandemic, and it seems that this year will mark the end of the search of populist candidates worldwide. We can appreciate this fact by the unusual characteristics happening nowadays. First, the defeated candidate in the US has not recognized his loss. Second, there has not started the traditional transition process from the Trump to the Biden administration. And third, this election represented a repudiation of the majority of the American people against this type of anti-establishment politicians who flourished some years ago all around the world and won several elections in different countries such as Brazil, the United States, India, and the United Kingdom. One of the most significant contributions that Latin America has made to international law is precisely the principle of non-intervention. Since 1933, the Convention on Duties and Rights of the States, the Montevideo Convention, recognized that no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another state. It must not surprise us these regions push to this principle as it suffered from multiple foreign interventions during the last 2 centuries. Initially by European powers and then by the United States as a product of the Monroe Doctrine, whose maxim was America for Americans. Later, the non-intervention principle God also codifies in the United Nations and the Organization of American States charters and was further developed by several General Assembly resolutions and by the International Court of Justice decisions such as the Nicaragua case between Nicaragua and the United States. During the 19th and the 20th century, it became common in Latin America the search of several doctrines that codified a national take to the principle of non-intervention. During this time, the Argentinian jurist Carlos Calvo proposed his famous doctrine that forced foreign nationals to accept the state's territorial jurisdiction where the economic dispute arose, preventing them from seeking the protection of their states of origin, which under the figure of diplomatic protection used it as an excuse to invade the foreign country. Following this trend, we also have the Drago doctrine created by another Argentinian jurist, Luis María Drago, who stated that a state's public debt could not lead to a third country's armed intervention. In other words, it rejected the possibility of collecting a contractual obligation forcibly. Mexico's take on the principle of non-intervention is also due to the multiple invasions that it suffered since it gained its independence from Spain. Under this precedent, 3 doctrines are relevant to this topic: the Juárez Doctrine, the Carranza Doctrine, and the Estrada Doctrine. First, the Juárez Doctrine was created by Mexico's president Benito Juárez when France invaded Mexico in the 1860s. Under this doctrine, it upholds the principle of defending national sovereignty, the right of self-determination of peoples, equality of states, and the prohibition of foreign intervention. During World War I, Venustiano Carranza, former president of Mexico, expanded the principle of the Juárez Doctrine, adding that nationals and foreigners have to be treated equally under the color of the law. This evolution culminated with Genaro Estrada, Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who adopted the Juárez Doctrine and the Carranza Doctrine to reject the recognition of states and governments' practice that most states exercise in their international relations. According to the Estrada Doctrine formulated on September 27, 1930, Mexico did not rule on foreign government recognition but will confine itself to the maintenance or non-maintenance of diplomatic relations. In other words, Mexico will maintain or withdraw where it deemed appropriate its diplomatic agents on one hand, and on the other, continue to accept when it also deemed appropriate the diplomatic agents accredited into Mexico without qualifying the right of foreign nations to maintain or replace their governments or authorities. In short, Mexico considered that government recognition was an insulting practice that violated the principle of non-intervention, since the recognition itself amounted to judging foreign states' internal affairs. The figure of states and governments' recognitions is a foreign policy tool that has existed in the international community for several centuries. Its purpose is quite clear: to set a government's positions on whether it recognizes or not a foreign government as the legitimate representative of a state. While the Estrada Doctrine, as we have mentioned, considers recognitions as denigrating, in practice, the vast majority of countries have not renounced it. Most of them use it as a useful tool to promote their interests and issue a clear signal about the person or regime with which they wish to maintain a political relationship. Historically, since the Westphalia Pact, the international community chose not to recognize a supranational authority, as the Catholic Church had been functioning until that time. Under this scheme, which still governs, there is no supranational authority establishing the game's rules. Hence, the international system operates in horizontal relations where the actors themselves choose to link themselves to the rules they create. The figure of recognition serves as the assessments that each state makes to determine whether it recognizes another entity as its peers, state recognition, or whether it recognizes a specific person or group as the representatives of a particular state. That is, the recognition of government. Mexico successfully applied the Estrada Doctrine in several chapters in history, such as the withdrawal of diplomatic relations under Pinochet dictatorship in Chile and Somoza dictatorship in El Salvador. In 2002, after the coup d'etat in Venezuela against Hugo Chavez, Mexico, without surrendering its obligations of humanitarian nature or solidarity with the people of Venezuela, in a strict application of the Estrada Doctrine, refrained from recognizing or not recognizing the new government of Venezuela and continued diplomatic relations with that government. Mexico's constitution contains a provision that codifies its foreign policy principles. Under Article 89, Section 10, Mexico's foreign policy has to be conducted following 8 normative principles: self-determination of peoples, non-intervention, peaceful dispute resolution, the proscription of the threat or the use of force in international relations, legal equality of states, international development cooperation, respect, protection, and promotion of human rights, and the promotion for international peace and security. While Mexico has a similar dynamic to the US between the executive branch and the Senate on foreign policy, Mexico's constitution states that the executive branch has exclusive power over foreign policy. Consequently, through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the President of Mexico is in charge of planning and executing Mexico's foreign policy. Mexico's Senate only has a marginal participation in the approval of treaties and ambassadors and consular generals' appointments ratification. It is essential to mention that the normative principles of Mexican foreign policy set out in Article 89, Section 10 are based on conventional and customary international law. Consequently, their interpretation should not be made believing that Mexico carries out the application of these principles without a specific interest. In other words, a state's foreign policy responds to their national interest. Under this vision, states see international law as an instrument through which they can advance their interests. For these reasons, when former US President George Bush asked Mexico's President Carlos Salinas de Gortari how does the Estrada Doctrine work because the US was invading Panama to capture its President Manuel Noriega, Mexico's President answered, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference. We recognize everyone." Notwithstanding this is a wrong interpretation of the Estrada Doctrine, it shows us how, through legal realism, the decision taken in foreign policy is effective. The interpretation of this principle varies through time, considering the changing dynamism in the international sphere Mexico's national interest, and Mexico's federal administration ideology. This flexibility is essential due to the evolution of the Mexican state and its diplomatic relations. The Mexico that existed in the 1930s when Genaro Estrada created this doctrine is not the same Mexico that exists today, and the international community is neither the same. In short, we need to see foreign policy principles as guidelines that can be put aside when necessary. Only through this vision we can construct a feasible explanation of why, in some situations, foreign affairs principles and doctrines are respected by the states to the world, and in others are simply ignored. We have to recognize that even though Donald Trump and Mexico's current president Andrés Manuel López Obrador had a good relationship, it is impossible to forget the asymmetry between both countries. Since the beginning of his first presidential campaign, Donald Trump attacked Mexico whenever it was possible. While being the president, he threatened to impose tariffs on all Mexican products imported to the US if Mexico did not stop illegal immigration from Central America and drug trafficking from Mexico. He also threatened to set a special tax on all cross-border crossings to make Mexico pay his water bill. And during the last month, US authorities detained in Los Angeles, California, Mexico's former Ministry of Defense, General Salvador Cienfuegos, on drug trafficking charges. Considering that Donald Trump will be in power until the end of next year's January, we can characterize Mexico's position as a self-help measure against a US administration that has used any situation as possible as an excuse to take unilateral actions against Mexico. Consequently, considering that there will be several weeks before any political transition occurs, this decision can be constructed as Mexico playing safe to avoid any last-minute confrontation with Trump's administration. More in line with the Estrada doctrine, other interpretation dictates that the government of Mexico as a foreign government should not have any particular interest in the winner of the US presidential elections. In other words, Mexico will continue having business as usual with the United States irrespective of who the president is. To support this claim, we have the vast net of treaties signed by both countries and the integration process that both countries and Canada have been living through since the North American Free Trade Agreement entered into force in 1994. Adopting a realpolitik perspective, we can conclude that this last hypothesis is the closest to the reality. US authorities regard Mexico as an intermediate issue. In other words, Mexico forms part of its foreign and domestic policy. For these reasons, Mexico is in no rush to define by his data who was the winner of the US presidential election and probably will wait until US authorities declare the official winner. During the last 2 centuries, the US military forces have entered without authorization on 13 occasions into Mexico's territory. Mexico ended up losing half of its territory to the US during the 1846-1848 war between both countries, and during several chapters in Mexico history, the US ambassador in Mexico City has inclined into one side or the other, depending on the US interest, Mexico's power politics dynamics. For these reasons, we can identify the US interventionist policies in Mexico's domestic affairs as one of the most influential factors that helped to shape most of Mexico's modern foreign policy principles and legalistic interpretation of international law. With this in mind, it becomes evident why Mexico is more cautious in congratulating Joe Biden for winning the US presidential election than recognizing in other altitudes newly elected officials. I hope this video helps you to understand better one of Mexico's core principles of foreign policy. Thank you very much for your attention. Don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel. Until the next time.